this is an individual that needs to be able to design or be the architect of the program. So all the elements that we discussed earlier, this needs to be a person that understands that all these processes, how do we integrate them into a cohesive system?
Hey, welcome to the FinTech Frontlines by Cora. This podcast is a collection of timeless ideas on how to build, launch, and operate a fintech in Africa from the most experienced minds in African fintech. In this episode, Marietta, Global Head of Licensing at Cheaper Cash, discusses how to build a compliance team from scratch. Who should be your first hire? Should you hire a consultant first?
Your consideration generally would be, for example, what are the resources available to the company? And that means sometimes that you must consider that you may not be able to hire. You may not be able to hire someone full-time, in which case the first engagement that you need to have is with a consultant. And this is a consultant who would be able to, possess the skills to give guidance to the business as it starts out. That could also be somebody that initiates the contact with the regulator and is able to guide that process. But if those resources are available, ideally the first hire is the Chief Compliance Officer, but it's a Chief Compliance Officer with a specific skill set. And that skill set is design and it is building. What do I mean by that? This is an individual that needs to be able to design or be the architect of the program. So all the elements that we discussed earlier, this needs to be a person that understands that all these processes, how do we integrate them into a cohesive system? So for example, if we're talking about onboarding, what are the regulatory requirements, for example? And what are the objectives when it comes to onboarding? And what are the problems that the regulators are trying to solve with the different jurisdictions? So for example, when we talk about onboarding of customers, a conversation that has been ongoing with the Central Bank of Nigeria for the longest period of time is financial inclusion. Now, why is financial inclusion a concern? Financial inclusion is always a concern when you have a large population. You don't necessarily have a centralized system of administration, especially when you have, a federal system of government where you have different states that have different processes when it comes to registering their populations. And so when you don't have a centralized form of identification, that can prove to be challenging because you require customers to present a government identification. And so, for example, if you're talking about people in marginalized areas, people who don't have certain levels of education, people who struggle with poverty, if you make the document that they must present to access your service a passport, you're going to exclude a lot of people from accessing your service. And so that has also contributed to the conversations around what identification can Nigerian nationals produce in order to access banking services. And that's what led to, the development of the BVN. But when you talk about Kenya, for example, Kenya has it's a small state, a much smaller population, has a centralized system of registration of persons. At 18, every Kenyan adult is issued with a national identification card, which is the universally accepted identification. Passports, not so much, but ID, yes. And so the discussion is not so much around inclusion because there is access to a common form of identification. Now, that's just one element of that program that I have mentioned to you. But ideally, the Chief Compliance Officer is a person that can understand how those principles can be distilled to build a program that makes sense for the company and then builds it in a way that provides room to scale. So it's definitely an individual with a very specific skill set, a builder, a designer, an architect. And this is also a person who eventually, after being the architect, can then bring the processes, the procedures, and the people together in the right order to build a functional compliance.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the FinTech Frontlines. For businesses that are bullish on Africa, Cora provides all the support you need to start and scale with delightful payment products for collections, payouts, and settlements. Learn more at corahq.com.